What I'm going to talk about today is actually a little broader than the title that's listed here, since the title seems fairly narrow and technical, focusing on UN reform and the Secretary General's new agenda for peace and preparations for what will be a major global summit later this year, which at least the hope is will result in something called the Pact for the Future, which already exists in draft form, and diplomats are busy working on that. This is the context for my reflections, though, because what I want to do is cover three main points. First, I want to step back from these efforts, the diplomatic machinations and the discussions in the UN, and ask what is the reality of the current challenges in peace and security that we face. Secondly, I want to look at what is the state of these efforts to deal with it, which will focus in on the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, the Pact for the Future, and all the diplomacy. And then again, step back and give a few broader reflections on a term that I'm borrowing from Oliver Richmond, which is what is the international peace architecture that we need or that we should think about for the 21st century challenges. And maybe we can think a little differently, as many of the previous speakers have suggested, about some of these challenges. The bad news is that I'm speaking at the end of a long afternoon, and most of the good points have already been made by my colleagues. So I'm going to cut out a few of the things that I would have said along the way. And I think it's going to highlight actually how interconnected most of these challenges are for peace and security. It's not separate from the climate challenges. It's not separate from the erosion of democracy and other things. So I want to start with my favorite quote, which is a different Italian philosopher, if you will, which is Antonio Gramsci, who said, the current crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old order is dying and the new cannot yet be born. And in this interregnum period, all sorts of morbid symptoms appear. And he was writing in 1930, after the start of the collapse of the global economic system, before the rise of Hitler, before the slide into World War II, and the catastrophic descent into that war. But he actually could see that we were at an inflection point internationally. And I think we might be at a similar inflection point, although historical analogies can both illuminate and mislead at the same time. So I don't want to stress that point, but I do think we need to have a longer term perspective than just what is the next 12 months or 18 months going to bring us. We can analyze the current crisis on three dimensions. And the first one is the military, strategic, and war focused dimension. And many people speak of a return of geopolitics and great power competition. We heard a little bit about that in terms of the tensions between US and China and Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia and beyond. And the role that rising powers are now claiming to have in the resolution of or the management of their own regional conflicts. Countries such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Brazil, Nigeria, many of them are playing a negative role in these conflicts. Some of them are trying to play a more positive role, but they're all claiming to have a much greater space and role in the resolution of these than beyond the great powers and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. Geopolitics actually never disappeared. What we called the unipolar moment of American dominance was also a form of geopolitics, and it gave rise to this sort of broad liberal consensus. But that was only a blip, and I think we're now witnessing a much more complex and multi-layered set of rivalries. But behind the geopolitics of that, the realities of conflicts, and many of them have already been mentioned, are extremely bleak. In Sudan, for example, more than 7 million people have been displaced. 7 million, which is a large number. 20 million people rely on humanitarian assistance because of the current violence and crisis. There's a civil war, full-blown civil war in Myanmar that has claimed more than 20,000 lives in the past couple of years, not to mention Gaza, the ongoing crisis in Yemen, and others. And the number of conflict-related deaths in 2022, 2023, we don't have full numbers yet, reached a 30-year high. So the highest point since the end of the Cold War. And of course, although there may have only been about 130 or 140,000 direct deaths, I think it's much higher for 2023, but we haven't counted. Millions more have been affected by internal and external displacement. But I think we also need to look, and this will be one of my final messages too, look beyond war and armed conflict to all forms of lethal violence. Sustainable Development Goal 16 talks about the achievement of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, and its first target is reducing all forms of violence everywhere. So when you step back from war, you see that many people are victims of lethal and less lethal violence around the world. Around 600,000 people died violently last year. Roughly, and here I'm afraid I have to contradict Kevin, 84% of them were men and boys, and about 16% of them were women and girls, which doesn't mean that the women don't bear a disproportionate impact, because of course the indirect consequences of the violence, which are associated with displacement and lack of access to basic services, fall disproportionately on the families that may have lost men to fighting, to war, to gang violence, and to other forms of lethal violence. But it's still gendered. The fact that it's men who are dying is also a gendered dimension of war and conflict. And we need to think hard about militarized masculinities, what leads to gang violence and mobilization around the world, and how to deal with that, as well as focusing on gender meaning just women, because I think it doesn't just mean that. I also want to highlight that interstate and civil wars are really only one kind of violent threat that people face. I think it was Volker that mentioned already in response to a question, high levels of sexual and gender-based violence and domestic violence within families and interpersonal violence as a result of some of these large-scale dynamics. And many countries around the world are actually more violent than in war zones. If you look at countries such as Honduras or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is suffering from high levels of forms of violence, but a little bit below war, El Salvador, South Africa, other parts of Central America. And so this highlights that we're a long way from Sustainable Development Goal 16. The second dimension of the crisis is actually political. It isn't just about strategy. It's about lack of trust in institutions and leaders for accountable and legitimate and representative government. And we know that this is manifest in a rising tide of populism, violent extremism, not just of Islamists, but also of right-wing and far-right groups in many countries around the world, including in the so-called global north or Western states, coupled with rampant disinformation and other sorts of propaganda campaigns, which I know that also is something Olivia is working on in a different context. So these are central issues that are not separate from the wars and violent conflict, because the political erosion of trust and legitimacy gives rise to, in fact, rhetoric between groups and often by political leaders that is very close to calling for violence against political opponents. Many things Donald Trump have said in thinly coded messages. And this encouragement and enabling of violence is something that needs to be combated. And finally, there's the structural dimension of the crisis, which has also been mentioned and illustrated very well by Volker's interventions. Such things as climate change and climate crisis have impacts on dislocation, displacement, and will also lead, I think, to conflicts in different forms. Maybe not wars, but that's really only one part of the puzzle. I want to just underline one other aspect that Kevin only briefly touched upon, and I think Olivia did as well, which is that the economic dislocations of the past 4 decades, which can be traced back to the rise of neoliberalism, roughly in the 1980s on forward, created a lot of winners, well, a small number of winners, a lot of losers, massive dislocations economically and otherwise that feed populism. And we know from historical experience, especially from the 1920s and early 1930s, that economic dislocation leads to a nostalgia for an imagined or actual past, and that can also feed mobilization. And I think this affects the economic underpinnings of the current crisis need to be examined more carefully. And we need to talk to the economists and the government officials who promote the kinds of policies that are actually making the situation worse. because everything we do to promote peace, if it isn't coupled with some attempt to achieve more fair and just redistribution of wealth, is not going to succeed. Okay, we all know most of these things. So what is it that the international community is trying to do about this? And what does it mean for UN and multilateral security policies? 2024 is this crucial year for the Summit of the Future, and the UN Secretary General's Common Agenda has 5 issue areas. I'm only going to focus on the peace and security one, but he also does talk about youth and future generations and global governance and sustainable development. But within the UN International Peace and Security Cluster, there are a lot of really good ideas that are being promoted. And these include such things as enhancing the scope and scale of preventive diplomacy, building stronger collective security machinery. His new agenda for peace, one of his proposals is to transform gender relations, and he even speaks in language that I've never seen in a Secretary General's document before, of dismantling patriarchal power structures. So they're putting their finger at least on some of the problems that are there. And there are 12 action points that are fairly elaborate, and these are laudable goals that the Secretary General is promoting. Other non-governmental groups have also made concrete suggestions, including reform of the UN Security Council, which is something that Japan has quietly and sometimes actively promoted at different times, strengthening UN conflict prevention in support of national prevention strategies, having rapidly deployable international staff and senior mediators to work in fragile and conflict-affected zones, and a sort of standby component of skilled and trained international civil servants who work on mediation or peace building and other such things. There is also, I think, on the good news side, real energy coming behind the idea of conflict prevention, especially in contexts that we know can lead to mass atrocities or large-scale violations of international humanitarian law and displacement. The current record is very bad in terms of the massive violations of international humanitarian law, especially in Gaza and elsewhere, and displacement. But at least there's now attention being paid to the idea that some part of attention should be devoted to greater prevention strategies. The bad news is that almost none of these really good concrete ideas are going to be realized in the Pact for the Future at the end of 2024. There's already a draft out there that speaks about very vaguely about strengthening or revitalizing or enhancing existing institutions and structures, upgrading the Peacebuilding Commission, reinforcing human rights mechanisms and the Human Rights Council, and progressing further on work towards the Sustainable Development Goals. But almost none of the language is concrete already in February. And it's not going to become much more concrete by later in the year. So if we step back, we might ask ourselves, if I want to be provocative, are we keeping a dying patient on life support here by putting all of our energy and attention into trying to rebuild, reinforce, revitalize, re-energize institutions, formal institutions, that are actually progressively failing to meet the challenges that we have? And I don't think we should pull the life support, but I do think we should rebalance the attention that we pay to formal institutions, UN strategies, high-level summits, rebalance that with other kinds of efforts and initiatives. And I want to spend a couple minutes on what some of those might be. Because what we don't want to have happen is what happened to the League of Nations in the 1930s, which continued meeting. And it continued meeting up until the very advent of World War II, valiantly trying to make some efforts, but it really wasn't where all the attention should have been. And I think diplomats in retrospect would have said, maybe we should have done a few things differently in the late 1920s and early 1930s, rather than just trying to work through existing institutions. So the good news, again, is that this international peace architecture, if you look back from the beginning of the 20th century, has actually been very adaptable. Collective security itself emerged out of the failure of the 19th century balance of power system. It broke down, but the United Nations and the Security Council system was a modified collective security model that depended on cooperation and a certain degree of trust among the permanent five. At first, and when it was only four, they were called the four policemen, I believe, because the idea was that they would maintain order, international peace and security. This mechanism was somewhat stillborn in the Cold War, but there were all sorts of other innovations that occurred. The invention of peacekeeping itself was a UN innovation. Peacebuilding, as a more recent large-scale activity, perhaps the core business of the UN peace and security architecture. Extensive mediation resources, civilian policing within UN forces, Chapter 7 operations, peace enforcement, and so on. All of these have actually contributed to adaptability within the system. And I'm not even mentioning many of the different regional efforts to build regional institutions for promoting peace and security, including in the African Union, including in ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum, and in Latin America and elsewhere. So there is a desire, and it has been manifest, to reduce the risks and costs of war. But where we are today is that this minimum amount of goodwill that is required for the permanent five members of the Security Council to operate collectively, this has more or less evaporated. Well, it has evaporated, not less or more, it has evaporated. The climate in Geneva and New York among the diplomats is worse than I have ever seen, and I've been working in Geneva for 30 years. They are not even able to have the kinds of conversations on the margins of meetings outside of the rooms where at least some minimal level of trust and mutual respect could be established. And I'm sure any of the diplomats who are here would also echo that feeling, and it's probably true also in places like Vienna and elsewhere. And so we have a situation where one member of the UN Security Council is actively violating the Charter. Others have done so in the past. Many in the West are currently turning a blind eye to the massive violations of humanitarian law committed by a state that is receiving Western arms and support, as Lisa has just pointed out. And the changing nature of conflict, which is the rise of armed groups, informal and non-state armed groups, and their easy access to weapons, to advanced weapons in many cases, allows the emergence of what we call in the jargon either hybrid or asymmetric conflicts that are much more difficult to manage and regulate than before with a traditional model of interstate war and interstate conflict. So in a sense, multilateral peace efforts are running behind, trying to catch up with the realities of some of the new conflicts. And mediation to end them has often also not resulted in sustainable peace. Results in a political settlement, an elite pact, what some people call a political unsettlement, where the same parties that were fighting have now dividing up the spoils and are entrenching their positions of power and are not doing anything to provide sustainable peace for their populations and legitimate and accountable governance. So what is to be done in this context? Well, the first would be to have some core values associated with our thinking about this, and human security, which is a core pillar of Japanese policy, but also within the UN system. It has ebbed and flowed in the popular language, but it should be central to many of our reflections on this. People, individuals, communities, national minorities are arguably the ones that are facing the most dramatic threats, especially of different forms of violence and insecurity. And if we just privilege the geopolitical language and the state-centric interstate concerns, it's going to be a very short-sighted and misguided attempt to deal with the challenges. So we should put human security reflections at the center. We should also not try and draw up elaborate blueprints and architecture for this new order. If we follow Gramsci's metaphor about the new order being born, we don't actually need more architects. What we need are midwives to accompany the process by which this new order will emerge, because it's only going to be done by the people who build the peace. And the role of international actors and international institutions ought to be to accompany this and to facilitate it, but not to pretend that we know how to do it, because we don't. If we did, we wouldn't be in the current situation. And I think we also need to start at home. Many of the current challenges that we face have their roots in local and national domestic political processes. the question that was asked earlier, well, what if Donald Trump is elected? Tells you that domestic political efforts and the rise of the support base, which is still a mystery to me. I'm a Canadian, so I spent part of my life looking at what happens south of the border with great mystification. But I think that that has tremendous geopolitical ramifications. But it's not just the US. It's Hungary that is paralyzing the European Union's ability to act cohesively in the case of the Ukraine. It's other countries that also are taking an authoritarian turn, as was earlier pointed out. So we need to start at home as well as thinking globally and try and affect change in our own political processes and political structures and mobilize around that. This is happening in lots of places. In places such as Northern Ireland or the Philippines or Somalia or Guatemala. And these are largely domestic political movements that I think can be expanded or at least need an expanded vision of solidarity across borders. And this would be my last point, which is that what we don't have are a set of guiding principles. You know, the humanitarian community has their 4 principles of neutrality and humanity and so forth. And we don't have that in the peacemaking or peace building space very well. Trust and solidarity are mentioned by the Secretary General very prominently, but we also need to focus on such things as humility, as I pointed out, respect for dignity of all the parties. You're only going to negotiate peace in the Middle East if all the parties respect the dignity of each other, and that's in short supply in many cases, and focus on building accountable and legitimate political institutions, which is not just about holding elections. The biggest failing of most peace processes is the lack of accountability that's built in to the political settlement after the elections occur. So if we can work from the bottom up around some core principles, focusing on what can be achieved locally, I think we can leave some of the bleak global picture behind because peace can be built in these pools as we spread them outwards, I think. And that would be my takeaway to the people who ask why should we not despair? Well, it's because you can do it. You just have to think tactically about where and with who and with what kind of positive effects you can bring. Thank you.
先ほどのキース・クラウスさんへのちょっと質問があるんですけれども、先ほど内政、その国内から変えていくことが重要だっていうふうな話をされていたと思うんですけれども、それを国連改革であったり、また多国間の協調っていうふうに当てはめたときに、その内政への介入っていう問題になるのかなっていうふうに感じまして、そこをそれぞれの国が自発的な形で変革していくのを求めるっていうのか、もしくはそれをある意味強制というか援助するような形で目指していくというのか、どういうアプローチを考えていらっしゃるのかっていうことをお伺いしたいです。
So when I say work locally, I think everybody's local can be different. Yours may be Japanese, it may be other countries in the region. Mine is Canada and Switzerland, etc. So it isn't about necessarily interfering in the internal affairs, to use that language. However, in the human rights arena, they have something called peer review processes, where states report on each other. I think it's called the Universal Periodic Review as well. They report to each other about the progress that they are making together. And peer review is actually a way to encourage states that are matched up in various ways to facilitate and help and work with each other. So it's not a penalizing top-down vision necessarily. Now, on the other hand, accountability is between the state and its citizens, but it's also between the state and international norms and laws and human rights norms and practices. So I think that there is a role for external holding to account of especially leaders and political elites that clearly violate the agreements and undertakings that they have made to their own citizens. And rather than viewing this as sort of a top-down global, national, regional, we should see it as an ecosystem in which different actors have different forms of power and different relationships. Many governments, many international agencies work closely with civil society in domestic, in national countries. And it's a delicate balance, but it's a much better metaphor for thinking about these interrelationships than interference in the internal affairs of states, because supporting a movement for accountability or greater gender equality in a country in the name of international norms is not the same kind of interference as invading the country.
My question is very simple. I would like all of you. What's your definition of peace? Because is that something that kind of like a utopian world, or is it or anything else? And then I would like to know how you think we should put as a goal when we say peace building. Thank you so much.
There are lots of surveys that are conducted and social listening exercises, and you universally find that people say, yes, of course, we want peace. But you're right to interrogate that, because they almost always mean something very different by that. And one person's peace is another person's subjugation or subordination or being dominated. And I think that's very tricky. So we need to recognize that, to use the jargon, peace can be an empty signifier, right? It can mean many different things to many different people. The definitions that you two offered are much more substantive. They're about relations. They're about well-being. And I would say, absence of pervasive threats to well-being and security, and the ability to realize potential or human potential, which is a mashup of what you have said, but is a short version. And that's fundamentally requires political institutions that can deliver the ability to achieve those things. So it's not an abstract concept. It has to be embodied in political institutions and practices.
And then, Mr. Krause, you mentioned peer review. Is that what you said? Can you? Can you tell me what that is? How many countries are involved? Can you give us examples how that works?
I have not checked the numbers on that, right? But I can give you two examples, one of which is not peace and security related, but in the OECD, they have donor peer reviews of practices. States have to be accountable to their peers, present a report about what it is that they're doing. There are other mechanisms where states have national action plans that are developed in contexts where you have to report on your progress in achieving certain kinds of goals. Sometimes it's to the entire community. Sometimes it's to a much smaller group. So peer is often meant to be a small group. And in the human rights world, it is periodic reviews that are then discussed and presented in the Human Rights Council. I think not every state every year. That doesn't work that way. But it's at least a model for creating some kind of accountability mechanisms that are actually quite sadly lacking in the peacemaking space. And one of the things that's occurred in the last 10 years is much greater emphasis on local ownership, which has actually reduced accountability, because international donors say, well, it's local ownership. They now are in charge of things, and therefore we will support them and then walk away. And that's not, of course, accountability in many senses. So any mechanisms that create forms of reporting and oversight can also involve civil society actors in some contexts.
I have a question to Keith related to the Summit of Future. As SGIUs, we are organizing the Future Action Festival in March, ahead of the Summit of Future, and we are trying to collect voices in Japan, youth voices in Japan, to try to make an input to the Summit of Future. So I read the zero draft of the Pact for the Future, and in that there is a section that trying to suggest establish national youth consultative bodies in each country. I think in your country there is Prime Minister's Youth Council. So I'd like to ask there is any good examples that the council is taking that we can learn from the Canadian youth.
Well, that causes me some trouble because, of course, I've been living in Switzerland for the last 30 years. So I'm Swiss Canadian. So I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that there is a civil society mobilization also around the Summit for the Future, which is organizing a conference in Nairobi in late summer, early fall. and promoting various forms of engagement, including in particular around youth. And they also speak, I think, of youth and future generations, because it's not quite the same as to say just youth. It's also how we think forward beyond that. I think this is, I think you just need to push for it, right, first, and get it. Because political elites are not necessarily listening to these voices in any meaningful way in most countries. And I would hazard a guess that it's probably not that influential in the Canadian context at this point. But this is an opening, and it's the first time this language is being very systematically promoted within the UN system. And it's clearly linked to the climate crisis, which has fostered a realization about who is going to deal with the consequences of this. So I think this is an opportunity to expand this agenda beyond this. And good luck.